For the Boston Celtics, it has been the kind of year teams dream about. Nightly clinics on how the game should be played. The architect, Larry Bird, arguably the NBA's best all-round performer. But Bird's 30 points took a backseat to the clutch second-half shooting of Dennis Johnson in the Celtics' first game playoff victory. Michael Jordan of the Chicago Bulls put on a memorable individual display in the opening game of the series. Virtually every move Jordan made proved successful. No matter who the Celtics tried, Jordan had the answer. A supreme effort that translated into 49 brilliant points. But when it ended, Michael Jordan and the Bulls came up short. Today is game 2. Again, it's Bird and Jordan, two great stars of the NBA. Square off in Boston, the backdrop, as the Celtics and the Bulls go at it once more in the playoffs.
Good morning. Several years ago, an article was published in the Journal of American Medical Association by Dr. Paul Ruskin on the stages of aging. In the article, he shares about a case study he once presented to his students when teaching in medical school. He describes this case study to the students in the following way. The patient neither speaks nor comprehends the spoken word. Sometimes she babbles incoherently for hours on end. She is disoriented about person, place, and time. She does, however, respond to her name. I have worked with her for the past 6 months, but she still shows complete disregard for her physical appearance and makes no effort to assist her own care. She must be fed, bathed, and clothed by others. Her food must be pureed, and her shirt is usually soiled from almost incessant drooling. She does not walk, her sleep pattern is erratic, and often she wakes in the middle of the night, and her screaming awakens others. Most of the time, she is friendly and happy, but several times a day, she gets quite agitated without apparent cause. Then she wails until someone comes to comfort her. And after presenting the class of future physicians with this challenging case, Dr. Ruskin then asks his students if any of them would like to volunteer to take care of this person, which no one volunteered. Then Dr. Ruskin said, "I am surprised that none of you offered to help, because actually she is my favorite patient. I get immense pleasure from taking care of her, and I am learning so much from her. She has taught me a depth of gratitude I never knew before. She has taught me the spirit of unwavering trust, and she has taught me the power of unconditional love." Then Dr. Ruskin said, "Let me show you her picture." And he pulled out the picture and passed it around. And as the picture passed its way around the room from student to student, there were initial chuckles and smiles. And then the students grew more and more still and quiet as the point of Dr. Ruskin's case study and their initial assumptions rattled around their heads and hearts. Because it was a picture of his 6-month-old baby daughter. So I share this story with you because it shows us the importance of perspective. Perspective is a funny thing to me because, like this story, it shows people can be part of the same conversation or even situation, but are thinking and processing it in a completely opposite way. When I think about perspective and where we can just overlook certain moments in Scripture, I always look back at the Old Testament, at the Israelites, and their time in Egypt as slaves and the 10 plagues that happened. And so today we're going to be looking and focusing on that mostly, but before we talk about that, we need to address how the Israelites came into Egypt in the first place. And so real quick, we're going to look through a few hundred years of history in about a couple paragraphs here. But again, there was Abraham who was called to go to another land. And he went, and he had a son Isaac, who then had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob then went and had 12 sons, and they were living in the land that had been promised them. And during this time, Jacob, his 12 sons, he had one whose name was Joseph. And most parents, you're not supposed to have favorites, but Jacob had favorites, and he went with Joseph. And so Joseph was his favorite, and his brothers didn't like that he was their favorite son, so they sold him into slavery. I don't think I could get away with selling my brother into slavery, I'm just saying. But that happens, and from there, after being sold in several series of events, he ends up in Egypt, where he eventually becomes Pharaoh's second in command. And as the reason he became that was there was a huge famine, and Pharaoh had this dream and didn't know what it meant. And Joseph came in and said, this is what is going to happen. There's a famine that's going to come in, but before there's going to be 7 abundant years. And so because of this and the warning that Pharaoh was able to have, Egypt was prepared and had spare food. And so Joseph's family heard this, and they went and asked if we could have some for our family. And through more events and series, Joseph and his family were reunited, and Pharaoh told Joseph's family, come and live here. And so they did, and they were given the land of Goshen, and years passed, Joseph died, and another Pharaoh came into power who didn't know Joseph. And he saw these Hebrews, the Israelites, and he decided, I can make use for them, and he turned them into slaves. And obviously, just like anybody, the Hebrews did not like this. And they cried out to God to deliver them from their slavery. And eventually Moses comes along, and God uses Moses to deliver the Hebrew people from captivity. And so the way that God set the people free is by getting to show off his power, which is where we're going to see is very devastating to the people of Egypt as he uses the 10 plagues. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to be looking at the plagues, which you can find in Exodus chapter 7. And we're going to start in verse 14. We're not going to read everything of it because it's chapter 7 through 11, and I don't think everybody wants to sit here this long this morning. So we're going to briefly touch on them as we go through it. And so again, looking at Exodus chapter 7, starting in verse 14, we find the plague of blood. So the first thing that God does is he turns the Nile River into blood. And it isn't just isolated to the river itself. It says that the blood was everywhere in Egypt, even in the wooden buckets, the stone jars. Basically, all of the stored water, even that wasn't by the river, was turned to blood. Kind of for us as we visualize today, knowing that we live next to the Snake River and that we have a lot of farmlands and we have canals and the irrigation, and even knowing today you can go to the store and buy a lot of bottled water, or even go a step above and get the big old container and fill it to have at your house for just that kind of water. What we could imagine is the Snake River's turned to blood. All the water in your house is turned to blood, even in your refrigerator, and then even at the store. It's all turned to blood. There is no more water. Now, most people, you would think, would look at that and be like, that's pretty impressive. But Pharaoh doesn't. And he looks at his magicians to use their dark magics, and they were able to do the same thing. So he just scoffs, laughs, and leaves. And so next you go to the plague of frogs. And a week goes by in between the first plague, now to this one. And God says, let the people go, or I'm going to fill this country with frogs. And he says they will come up into your palace, your bedroom, into your own bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs. These frogs are going to be everywhere, and sure enough, and again, Pharaoh looks to his magicians, and they use their dark arts, and again, they reproduce this plague like the first one. So Pharaoh, again, isn't impressed. I know for us, I can't imagine opening up the oven and all of a sudden frogs are coming out of it trying to cook some pizza. Or even just laying and taking a nap and there's frogs in my bed. But this is happening, and again, no, it's not a big deal. And Pharaoh tells Moses and his brothers and his brother Aaron to pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord. So Moses agrees to this and tells Pharaoh that I'm going to hold you to your honor. And Moses prays to God to take the frogs away, except for those already from the Nile. And God does this, but Pharaoh goes back on his word. It's kind of important, too, to know as well, Moses' upbringing was in Pharaoh's palace. So he grew up with this certain Pharaoh, with Ramses, almost like a brother. And so it kind of would be hard to all of a sudden, my brother is now playing games with me as I am trying to be there for my people and to get freedom for them and do what God is asking to me. Here's somebody who I've loved in my life, and now he is doing this to me. And so it goes from the plague of frogs to the plague of gnats, which, understanding what gnats are, they are pests. Gnats are found any place in the world where there is a river or stream because they lay their eggs in watery places. They need the blood of warm-blooded animals to survive, and unlike mosquitoes, gnats usually don't bite through clothing, but they can crawl into your hair or under clothing to get at places such as ankles and belt lines. So this is what's coming next. So, and again, for me, when I think of gnats, I'm thinking of I've turned the car on in the morning to get ready to take the boys to school, or I'm coming home and it's a little bit warmer and I got these tiny little bugs just circling around my side rear mirror. And I walk to my car to try to get in before I walk through them, and then I get that like single one that like gets right in my eye. And I'm like, I open my mouth for 1 second too long because the next one flies in my mouth. And then I spend a minute just wiping my hands over my face and my tongue to get this feeling off of me of like, I had a bug on me, this is gross. And so here with Moses, we can see it is way worse than that. This time God says to strike the dirt with a staff, and the dust on the ground through Egypt will become gnats. So again, imagine as we, in southern Idaho, have some really nice windstorms with some dust that comes in. And sometimes it's super thick where you can't even see in the road. We could imagine a little bit the idea, but imagine that is gnats everywhere, all over. And Egypt being a pretty dry place, they have a lot of dust. So for all of it to rise from the ground to become a wave of gnats had to have just been awful. And for Pharaoh, this time he turns to his magicians, but they can't reproduce this plague. And in fact, they tell Pharaoh that this is the finger of God. But again, Pharaoh does not listen. And so next comes the flies, the plague of flies. And God says that if he isn't listened to, he's going to send his swarm of flies everywhere. I will send swarm of flies on you and your officials, on your people, and into your houses. But he isn't going to touch the land of Goshen, which is where the Hebrews live. And so the flies come, and it says that the land of Egypt was ruined by the flies. And now there are definitely times, especially when it gets hot during the summer, where we'll get flies in our house. I'm sure some of you can relate. And you always think there's 2 or 5, but it's just the 2 or 5 you're seeing at the time, and you're hoping that it's not more than that because you went from one room to the next, and you just hope it just stuck with you. But no, and it is just obnoxious. But I've never seen flies have a devastating effect on the area around me. But here it's describing a devastation that's happening. And so Pharaoh calls Moses and says, I'll let you sacrifice, just do the sacrifices here. But Moses says that the Egyptians aren't going to like the sacrifices that they're going to be doing. And in fact, the Egyptians, if they saw it, they would attack the Hebrews. And so Moses is now just asking, let us go into the desert for 3 days. And Pharaoh says, okay, I'll let you go. Just don't go very far. And so God takes away the flies, and once again, Pharaoh goes back on his word. And so next it goes into the plague of livestock. And here it says that God would kill all the livestock in the field, all of the horses and the donkeys and the camels, and on your cattle and sheep and goats. But that again, there would be no distinction between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. So this ends up happening, and again, Pharaoh says no. So now all form of transportation or luxury transportation has gone away from the Egyptians. Food has gone away from them. And again, they're seeing the Israelites, they're spared, but theirs are now gone. And now it goes from livestock to the plague of boils, which are going to spread across the land of Egypt. And it gets not only the people, but the remaining animals as well. Now, obviously, being covered in boils, and it's going to be severe because God is making a point here, would be awful, but I can't imagine sitting there having like dogs and cats covered in boils going around, whelping and whining at my feet constantly. I am feeling miserable. I don't need anything else to feel miserable in front of me, but that's what they're getting. But still, Pharaoh says no. And next comes the plague of hail, and now we can see God is getting more serious. In Exodus chapter 9, verses 13 through 14, it says this: Then the Lord said to Moses, Get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. Now, up to this point, the plagues that have happened are pretty substantial and very impressive feats. But now all of a sudden God is saying, I'm going to send the full force of my plagues against you. Just so you know, your magicians, there's nobody like me. Jumping down to verse 22, it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Stretch out your hand toward the sky, so that hail will fall all over Egypt, on people and animals and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Hail fell and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. The only place it did not hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Recently, we were just on our way to Salt Lake to take our boys to Lagoon, and on the way, it was raining, and it had a massive just hailstorm that literally stopped all traffic on the freeway. I remember driving, and I couldn't see anything in front of me, and I randomly saw the car in front of me, the taillights, and it was getting off the road, so I followed because that was my only visual marker I had. I figured I'd rather be off the road if somebody comes flying through than being stuck here not knowing. But we sat there, and it was about 30 seconds of just no visual, no sight, but then it goes. But every hailstorm I've been in, you always see like the hail on the ground, but I've never seen destruction come from it. But here, it is a storm that is going to destroy and beat everything down. And so after this happens, Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron and says, I've sinned, and that the Lord is right, and the Egyptians are wrong. Then he says, pray to stop this, and I'll let your people go. But they pray, and it stops, and then after this, just like Pharaoh's done time and time again, in verses 34 and 35, it says, he sinned again and wouldn't let the Israelites go. And so next comes the plague of locust, which is when they come, it says that there were so many, and it was so thick that the ground couldn't be seen. And the ground is actually described as being black. There were so many locusts. This swarm of locusts was the biggest swarm that had ever happened or probably ever will. And it says that when they left, nothing green was left in all the land of Egypt. So again, Egypt being a very desert area, any of the green you can find is a bit of a luxury. It's all gone now. Everything up to this point and now this have just decimated it all. I don't know if you've ever seen a video of a swarm of locusts before, but it's kind of one of those things where as you see all these locusts come through in an area, you see people out there trying to beat and keep them away from just a small area so they can just have something left because they just know we have no chance. But if we can keep this, we at least have something left. But again, this isn't what happens. And so again, we've had the flies that have come in and destroyed. The hail has come in and destroyed. And now all of a sudden, the Egyptians are going to be left with nothing that they can eat, feed any sort of animal that is left alive, if there are any. And there's no source of relief or relaxation that can be had now in their home country. I think of just the fact that we're able to go across the street to a park that is very nicely shaded and has grass that is nice and can be comfortable to sit in. They've lost it now. And so now you would think you would hear that Pharaoh would want them to let the people go and have freedom. But again, he does not. He says no. And it's followed now by the plague of darkness. And so next, the plague of darkness spread all over Egypt for 3 days. And it is described as a darkness that could be felt. It was so dark that no one could see anyone else or leave their house. I think of the time where we went on a church trip to Oregon, and we went to these caves. I can never remember the name of these caves, but they were like a mile-long cave and had a tunnel, and at one point it was about 200-300 feet where you had to get on your hands and you were just crawling through just to get to the very end of the cave where there was a little small pocket. And I think we fit about 20 teenagers in there, and our youth pastor was in there, and he decided to use that as a really good teaching time to talk about the difference of light and dark. And so we're all in there with our flashlights, and it's a very cramped space, and all of a sudden he's like, all right, I want everybody to turn their flashlight off. And the really funny thing I always remember about this trip was 3 other teenagers did not have flashlights from another random group that was visiting, and they just stuck with us because we were their source of light. They get back to the end, and I don't know if they went to church or not, but they got to have an experience of what Gooding Youth Group was like in an impromptu lesson. And their eyes got huge when they heard the fact the lights were all going to get turned off in this tiny, cramped little cave. And we turned it off, and immediately it was just like a pressure came on you. And it was very much like, I know there's somebody next to me, and I hope they're the ones moving and it's not something else. And it took about 2 seconds for one of the girls to just shriek and scream because she was freaked out. And we turned the lights back on. But this is the only example I have personally that I can imagine what it felt like to feel darkness. I've done overnighters where we've had kids in the church and we've played games in the dark, but there's always the street lights outside. So yes, it's dark, but you can adjust your eyes to the dark and kind of see shapes and move and be able to go around. But to see nothing, I can't, even when it's supposed to be right now in the middle of the day, I can't imagine that. But then it goes from that to the plague on the firstborn. Now the last plague, the death of the firstborn, this is the plague where in one night all the firstborn were struck down by the Lord, except for those who had followed God's command and had covered their doorframes with sheep and goat's blood. Then it says that Pharaoh and all of his officials and the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Now this one's just crazy to think about the fact that for, again, 3 days of darkness that happened, and you follow it with so much death that every house of the Egyptian has a dead body in it. I can't imagine Kimberly being covered in darkness and in one night every house has a dead body in it. Growing up, this plague was always kind of one of those like, whatever, I'm the second born. I'm good. But now having children of my own, I realize it's a little bit more of a problem. See, it wouldn't just be my older brother dying. Now it would be my firstborn son. And to have that would just be awful. And again, all these other ones have been awful and miserable. But now it is the distinction of something else completely. In one night, God was able to kill one person in each household. And this finally happens, and it even affects Pharaoh's house where his son dies. And I can't imagine that this is an easy time for Moses too, because basically his nephew is killed too. So it's got to be hard. He's got to be conflicted. But again, he is doing what God is asking, and Pharaoh lets Moses and his people go. So then after all of this, the Israelites leave, and they're traveling to Mount Sinai, which is where Moses first saw God at the very beginning before all this happened, who was in a bush that was on fire but was not burning up. However, on the way, Pharaoh sends his entire chariot army, which at this time is one of the most deadliest forces in the ancient world. And he sends them after. They're a little bit more like, we've just suffered. And again, at the time, the Egyptians were so thankful that the Israelites were leaving, they were giving all of their riches, all of their wealth to them, just like, please go. It's like, I would rather be broke than have you here. But now it's very much of, no, we want some payback. We're going to bring some of this back. Some of our way of life has now been sacrificed because they've left. We now have to do work. And we want a little bit of payback. So as the Israelites were camped along the Red Sea, they see the army and God parts the water. Again, something that's got to be just crazy powerful to witness. And they walk through on dry land, through the middle of a sea. And they see a pillar of fire stop the Egyptians from pursuing. And as the Israelites reached the end of the other side of the Red Sea, just before that happened, God allowed the fire to come up because he knew the Egyptians would pursue. And so they pursue and they go after, and just before they get to the other side and before they can get to the Israelites, God swallows them up in the Red Sea and they all die. One of the most powerful military forces in the world, gone just like that. And so the Israelites continue on their way, and they finally make it to Mount Sinai, and God says to Moses, which we can see in Exodus chapter 9, verses 3 through 6, where he says, "Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, 'This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I have carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites, and the people are to reply back to God.'" And so in verse 8, we see their response. It says, the people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." And so Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. And not only this, but they literally get to feel and experience the presence of God. If you jump down to verse 16, it says, "On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. And then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him." And after this, we see that Moses goes up to talk with God and tells the people to wait at the bottom. Now, I don't know about you, but if we were to experience that on a very weekly basis, I think it would drastically change how we view God each and every day. To all of a sudden come to church and the building shaking. To have fire, the smoke, the trembling, the loud sounds, that would be a little bit of a God awe-inspiring moment. But here in the story is where it always blows my mind at how crazy humans can be with decision making. And as I say that, I do include myself in there because I've known I've done some very foolish things in my life. After coming out of Egypt and seeing the destructive force and the awe-inspiring power that God demonstrated while the Israelites were there, after watching the army of soldiers who had oppressed them their whole lives die right in front of their eyes, and after feeling the presence of God literally in front of them, and him telling them that they will do everything that he says, they turn around and they go and they make an idol. They make a golden calf, and not only that, they make Aaron, who was one of the two main guys who spoke to Pharaoh, and in front and center to the destructive power of God that God had used to set the people free, he goes and he makes it for them. I mean, you would seriously think that Aaron, after seeing all this stuff up front, personal, close, would say, no thanks. I'm not going to build this for you. I am more afraid of God than I am of you. But he goes on to say that this golden calf, their God, which is a little g, is the God that brought them out of Egypt. Now, if you're like me, it's super easy to look back at what God did in the Bible and wonder how those people could go and make the choices they went and made. But I wonder sometimes, as we are looking and seeing this and reading it and studying it, I wonder what our perspective is actually like. Because if we were to go back to this idea of perspective, and now looking at it, a two-sided conversation that's going on between the church and the world that we see nowadays. As Christians, we are called to love, evangelize, witness, hold others accountable, and live our lives for God each and every day. And there are so many godly men and women who would say they do this all over the world, but when we look at the church, we don't always see it. If you need examples of this, go to any social media platform and find a Christian post and then look at the comments. Or if you were to go to the comment section of any YouTube video that you can find of a pastor that would go and share maybe a devotional thought or a sermon or maybe whatever it is, you're always going to see a conversation that's going back and forth between the Christians and the non-Christians. And it's crazy that you can watch a video where the speaker is professing the good news and calls us as Christians to seek and save the lost, and then scroll down about 2 inches into a comment section where somebody who does not believe in God says something obviously that's not favorable to the Christian video. And all of a sudden, the Christians have to now argue and support and attack those people. They've also missed the point completely. We are called to love and witness to those who don't know God. And more often than not, they are attacked by the people from the church, and then we wonder why they don't trust the church. We wonder why people sometimes don't feel safe sharing and bringing things in the church when we as a church sometimes attack each other as well. The church has to come together and be united, not only in what we teach, but in how we love, in how we witness, in how we are to be examples for the men and women who live in this world. Some of you may be like me, and a lot of times we would just prefer things to just be by ourselves. I know I've shared before in the past of I hated group projects at school. You had to rely on other people. There's times here, even at church, where when you have to rely on other people in different areas where it's like, I can't do it, but I have to trust and rely on somebody to do it the way I hope they're going to do it. And so for us, we have to make sure we have to adjust our perspectives because Unfortunately, if that's the way we want things to be, God did not make the church an individual thing. We are to be together and united. Some of you are probably wondering why the opening video was of the Chicago Bulls and the Boston Celtics playoff game, which is why we're coming to now. See, growing up, I loved watching Michael Jordan play for the Chicago Bulls. I know, especially, I think it was the 96 against the Salt Lake Jazz, or the Utah Jazz, excuse me, where I remember even getting to watch with Grandma. And I was sitting there fully going for Michael Jordan, and I remember she just was like, I'm tired of him winning. And I'm like, well, I'm not. He's the best. He's, in my opinion, the greatest. I know there's arguments that would go on today of who is the greatest. But for me, it's what he did and could do with the basketball while playing was incredible. And then back in 1986, where this video, like I said, was the promo for Game 2 of the best-of-5 series between the Celtics. So the Bulls were playing and going against the Giants of the Boston Celtics. If you know anything with basketball, the Boston Celtics have been annoyingly one of the best teams throughout history of basketball. And so at this time, they're the number one. And so at this point in their season with the Celtics, they've only lost one home game, and it was to the Portland Trail Blazers at that time. And so during this season, as it's leading up to it, before it starts, it's kind of fun now that I'm an adult and I know how to look up different things. And you weren't as connected to new things going on at the time growing up with the NBA, but now you get to have documentaries of all the things that happen. So for me, it's always fun and fascinating. When a new one comes out, I usually hop on it and watch it within one night of where I should be going to sleep. But I watch it, and I see these things happen. And I got to learn so much more of what was going into this game, which makes it even more incredible of what he did. Because before the 1986 series had started, Michael Jordan had gotten hurt and was more than likely potentially missing his second year in the NBA. But he was such a competitive player, he wanted to train and recover and recoup, and the Bulls organization said, no, we want you to rest and take time. And so he said, can I at least go back home and just lightly do my own workout? And they said, sure, you can do that. So he went back to North Carolina, where he spent the whole year training with the University of North Carolina, where he went to school, which he was not supposed to do, and he didn't tell anybody he was doing it. He just did it. And so he finally comes back to Chicago to be evaluated for his injury. All of a sudden, he is playing better than he was before his injury. And they're like, what have you been doing? He's like, well, I've been training. And so at this point, as he's coming back, the Chicago Bulls are at the midway point of the year, and they have to evaluate, like a lot of NBA teams do, of are we going to try to make the playoffs, or do we want to have a good lottery pick for the next year's NBA draft happen? And so they're coming back in, and Michael Jordan, who is just, again, Rookie of the Year, a powerhouse player, dynamic. Nobody has seen his like in the NBA. He wants to come back, and he is just ready to go. And the Bulls say, we're only giving you about 15 minutes a game. That's it. We're giving you a line. They decided as an organization that you kind of get to speculate, but they get to look. They were going for the lottery pick. If you don't know with the NBA, the lower your record is, the better chance you have for a top lottery pick. And so they're like, we could go either way. Let's go for the lottery pick. Some teams now will literally not play some of their best players, so they'll lose games on purpose so they have a shot at the draft. And so this is what's happening, but Michael Jordan doesn't like that. He was such a competitive player that he made sure that his limited minutes would make something. He had some games where 2 minutes left in the game, it's a tie game, he gets pulled. It's been going back and back, point to point, and he has to sit there on the bench and just hate every minute of it because he's perfectly healthy enough to play, but they're choosing to not let him play. And he almost wills his team into the playoff picture, which is not what they were hoping to have happen. They were going for the lottery pick. Michael Jordan said, nope, I want to make the playoffs. I'm here to win. He hated losing. And so they do, and they make the playoffs, and they're the lower seed playing the number 1 seed. And so he goes in, and they finally said, all right, there's no minute restriction. You're just playing. And he goes, in the first game, if you notice, they said he scored 49 points, which is pretty impressive for anybody to score a lot of points like that. And now we come into game 2, and as you go into this, he goes on a crazy game where he scores 63 points. It was a record high for the Chicago Bulls, and it is a playoff record that still stands to this day. And so for the game, it had been close. It was point to point. The Boston Celtics, I think, tried every single star they had on the team to try to shut Michael Jordan down, and they couldn't do it. He got the ball, he was going to score. And after 2 overtimes, one of which Boston was ahead by 2, Michael Jordan gets fouled and gets to shoot 2 foul shots where he makes both of them to lead into a double overtime. Again, in the end, the Bulls lost by 4. And they have like YouTube videos and different things that talk about it from the Celtics player, from the Bulls players, where they talk about this performance and just the fact of, I always have loved Larry Bird's comment was, Michael Jordan was not playing basketball that night. It was God playing as Michael Jordan. Of just the fact of what he was doing was unreal. However, one player was pulling all the weight in this game, and in the end, they came up short. See, in the church, we can't afford to lose. We need that edge, that mentality of I cannot lose when it comes to things in the church. Because the Bulls, they just lost their chance at a championship that year. But eventually with the Bulls organization, they brought in more players that could help and support Jordan, so he didn't have to carry the entire load of winning by himself. And in the process, they ended up winning 6 championships by 1996. But the thing is, when the church loses, it's not as trivial as losing a basketball game. When we lose, we are losing the souls of men and women who desperately need to know the love of God. And so for us, we need to adjust our perspective to be one that is not of our own, but is one that would go and witness to the world and have God's perspective towards the world that he has. Would you pray with me as we close?